Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our public lecture, the fourth in 2019. And I'm glad that there's quite a lot of conversation going on. At least that will keep everybody warm and hopefully also everybody attentive. So thank you very much for taking this time. I welcome you all to this public lecture, and we're going to have Yvette, but she'll be introduced shortly. Allow me to just make one or two very quick comments, and then I'll invite Sally, who is going to introduce Yvette for us. As usual, as I said before, this presents for us at STIAS an opportunity of engaging with the broader public and also with the Stellenbosch University, the universities in the Western Cape, and through you to the rest of the continent and the world. And so we would like to thank you very much for being those vehicles that help STIAS do what it's supposed to do. Of course, as a new kid on the block, it has been 7 months of very good experience with the fellowship at STIAS, a very healthy engagement with the Stellenbosch University academic environment, including the leadership of the university. And I would like to thank them very much for that warm reception and engagement as we continue to work on this journey. And also it's been an opportunity for me to begin to reach out to the rest of the South African universities and also the rest of the African universities. STIAS sits on the continent of Africa, and so it's also our responsibility that we provide that creative space of the mind that STIAS provides for the rest of the African scholarship to engage with the rest of the world. So I would like to thank again the international scholars that are at STIAS, and also ask them that they leave something on the continent during their time at and in the continent. So for this occasion, we are honored again to have our STIAS Fellow in Residence, Yvette, who is going to speak to us on the topic of untold wealth for the benefit of the world. And again, you can see that she's reflecting on liberated Africans and the cost of freedom. Sometimes we think freedom is for free and that we just get it. And so we're looking forward to that presentation. But before she comes, I'd like to introduce Professor Sally Ann Murray, who is going to introduce our speaker. And Professor Sally Murray is the chair of the Department of English at Stellenbosch University. And Professor Murray is a distinguished scholar and teaches and writes on, among other things, South African identities in literary, visual and material cultures. She writes on cityness, place, space, and she also writes on autobiography, identity, and autoethnography, among other things. And Sally, we look forward to your new publication on queering the South African short story. That is going to be very interesting reading, which is coming up in the Journal of the Commonwealth Literature. It reminds me of a book by, I think the scholar is Robert Morel, who was at University of KwaZulu-Natal, and he wrote a book on changing men in Africa, in Southern Africa, and people kept reading it as changing men rather than changing men. And so I'm hoping that you will not read or reread Sally's coming publication of queering the South African short stories as queering the South African short stories. So Sally, it's yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Great to have a good audience because we have such an outstanding speaker. I mean, I think that Professor Yvette Christiansë scarcely needs an introduction, but here I go. And if it's somewhat long, it's because your career is so illustrious. So, Yvette Christiansë is the Whitney Olin Chair, Professor of Africana Studies and English Literature at Barnard College, Columbia, New York. In addition to chairing the Africana Studies Department, she directs the department's Harlem Semester Program. And this is a program that brings together artists, students, faculty, with various kinds of community organizations, as well as outfits such as the Apollo Theatre, the Harlem Dance Theatre, and so on. I believe you've recently stepped down from directing Barnard's Council in order to chair a committee on inclusion for the college's periodic accreditation review. We all know about those sorts of things. We know you're going to do a good job on that one. Push them. Right. I think, though, that most of us know Yvette Christiansë as the author of Toni Morrison and Ethical Poetics. I mean, Morrison, you know, has recently passed. But then we admire her too as an award-winning poet and novelist. I mean, her collections, now I'm going to anglicize horribly, Jure and Cast Away, and then her very acclaimed first novel, Unconfessed. It's become such an important text on many university syllabi, including those of our own department, where I know that my colleague Tina Steiner went to great lengths to source sufficient copies for our graduate students. What some people might not know is that our speaker today is also a librettist, that she has been working with Rosalind Morris of Columbia University since 2012 to bring to life the English translation of Abdulrahman Munif's Cities of Salt. This is a narrative about the arrival of oil capital in an unnamed Gulf state. So it's an opera. The opera premiered at Covent Garden Theatre in July 2015, and in the same month at the Royal Opera House, they showcased 3 scenes as an intermezzo. And she's busy on another libretto with the same collaborator, this time working with the Syrian-born composer Zaid Jabri. This is an opera called Southern Crossing, and it's based on the encounter in Cape Town between Darwin and Herschel. That's going to premiere in April 2020 in New York. Wish I could be there. Christiansë, overall, she's an internationally renowned, award-winning scholar and writer, noted for her outstanding critical and creative work on slave registers and the traumatic afterlives of slavery across the diasporas of the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans. Now, what especially attracts me to her work is its purposeful multiplicity. It's a resourceful, and I mean resourceful, looking again at sources, reconfiguring them, a resourceful ranging and rearranging across genres and forms in seeking to investigate the economic, the political, and the affective intersections of questions around slavery and diaspora. As she writes in the melancholy archive of Cape colonial slavery, Sila van der Kaap's story is one not only of thwarted hope, bitter disappointment, and stubborn presence, but also of a desire for speech resulting from the inability to be heard fully within slavery's discourse. Here is a quote. "What is disappearing then? A name that is one of many versions of itself, skirting the vicinity of a woman I have been calling Sila, because that is the name she answers to in a court of law. What is disappearing? A word effectively charged, caught between translation, pointing to an opacity behind which something moves. Lives of people, lives moving against each other, away from each other, a woman washing linen, a boy running to fetch lemons, complaining of pain, some bread, some grease, a knife, and the presence of a woman called mistress of a house some 300 paces away, and behind her, ox straps close at hand, a man who is called master, a boy dead, a woman consigned to death, a history of living death. The archive is haunted by them all." Please join me in welcoming Professor Yvette Christiansë.
Thank you so much. so deeply moved. I remember when the wonderful artist Ntozake Shange, who alas is no longer with us, and a Barnard alum she was, came to read, and I had this idea of how we would really, really celebrate what she had given to us. And I ran and photocopied bits of from every book that she'd written and put them on the seat in an auditorium full of 500 people. And then we all got up and we just read for 3 minutes. Didn't matter what we were reading. And it was, I think, what an author dreams of, and that is, you can't hope for it, but maybe if you're lucky it's happening, is that if you were to listen, you would hear around the world reading. Thank you, thank you. Edward, thank you so much for that gracious introduction. I'm just going to go straight to it, although I do always acknowledge the Harlem semester was actually put together by all of the faculty in the Africana Studies department. It was a real tutti, so one must footnote and acknowledge. To water. I'm going to speak today from this work that's been gripping me now for over 2 decades. And so you're getting a tiny bit, and the anxiety of producing something like this is the same effect as when you haven't seen someone for many years and you try to fit into the first 3 minutes everything that you haven't said for those many years. So I hope I'm a little disciplined here. As you know, I have this unwieldy title, The Untold Wealth for the Benefit of the World, Liberated Africans and the Cost of Freedom. Let Africans remain in Africa. That was the implicit advice given in 1873 by George Sullivan, a commander in the British Admiralty's anti-slaving fleet. Sullivan's proposal addressed and reversed centuries of forcible removals of Africans from the continent, for enslavement in places across the Atlantic Ocean, across and within the Indian Ocean, across the Arabian Sea, the Mediterranean, and into the Persian Gulf and Caribbean waters. By 1873, ships from the British Navy had been patrolling most of these waters for some 65 years. They did so to enforce Britain's 1807 abolition of the Slave Trade Act, which was, of course, not the only one. There had been decrees and measures abolishing or limiting slavery in its various institutional forms around the world and across the centuries, and in contexts in which Africans were not the only enslavable subject. And I think it's very important to point this out, although the enslavement of Africans is my focus today. America had in fact banned the slave trade in March 1807, but implemented the law in early 1808. Denmark banned the transatlantic slave trade in 1792, Cuba 1811, Sweden 1813, the Netherlands 1814, Portugal 1819, and France 1817. And that ban went into effect in 1826. In 1822, the Zanzibar-based Omani Said ibn Sultan agreed to stop selling slaves to Christian countries, and he sanctioned the British seizure of any dhows carrying slaves between Cape Delgado and the coast of India. He signed another treaty in 1845 that also prohibited slaving outside of his Zanzibari-controlled areas. And in 1873, the same year that Commander Sullivan published his memoir of serving in the British Navy's prevention fleet, particularly around Zanzibar, Said ibn Sultan's successor, Sultan Bargash, ended all slave trade in his East African dominions, but not in Oman. The territorial scope of the British Act was vast, given the geographical expanse of British imperialism and colonialism. And that also produced a massive archive, and I'm going to rely a lot today on that archive, although I do read across other archives with some help with the Arabic translations, Portuguese and Spanish translations, for example. So unlike other decrees, the British aspired to nearly universal prohibition, grounded in a reformed humanism and spurred by economic rationales that looked more and more to the economic opportunities of laissez-faire market relations, fueled by the monetary gains to be had through waged labor. A new domain of value was emerging, trading in the end of the slave trade. But I'm leaping ahead. Beginning in 1819, the British West Africa Squadron began patrolling the waters of West Africa, with America patrolling the Caribbean waters until 1861, and also the mid-Atlantic, and Brazil patrolling its own coast until 1822. By the mid-1840s, the West African maritime trade had been reduced significantly, but the trade had simply rerouted, some pushing up through older routes through the Sahel, and others going to the newly energized older trade routes in the Indian Ocean, particularly in the Mozambique Channel. The British Prevention Squadron increased its patrols in the Indian Ocean by the mid-19th century. And while the trade was banned, domestic slavery remained untouched in British and other European colonies, and in America, and in places like Oman. In other words, those already enslaved were not included in the bans on the trade, and neither the institutions that depended upon slavery nor the consciousness that justified it could be transformed without broader structural and ideological changes. For such reasons, the gap between the abolition of the trade and of slavery itself was often conceived, sometimes by people of very differing ideological commitments, as a problem of time, or a promise to be realized, an horizon to be reached. The result was a tension between the de jure and the de facto domains, if you like, the ideal and the reality. This was no more true than for those who were liberated from the holds of slave vessels that continued to run Africans across the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, into the Mediterranean, and across the Arabian Sea. With some exceptions, the majority was sent on to places deemed safe enough to prevent their recapture and sail into slavery. Although the means and the knowledge and will to restore people to homes did exist, liberationist authorities justified the transfer of liberated Africans to unfamiliar places on the basis of perceived and verifiable vulnerability to recapture once returned. Instead, these people who were called liberated Africans, sometimes captured Negroes, sometimes engagés, sometimes recaptives, but most generally liberated Africans, you could just hear the deep ironies across that instability, that not knowing what to really call them, right? They were sent to British colonies and other settlements, places like Sierra Leone, Gabon on Africa's Atlantic seaboard, St. Helena in the South Atlantic, British colonies in the Caribbean, then known for, as far as the British were concerned, the British West Indies, and the Seychelles, Mauritius and Durban in the Indian Ocean, Aden in the Gulf, and Mumbai in India, then called Bombay. Or as Gayatri Spivak reminded me, Bombay. I had no idea it was Bombay, the beautiful bay, Portugal. Okay. As late as 1875, the British Consul General stationed at Zanzibar, who had also been in that circuit of colonial officers in the Seychelles just before that, one W.F. Prideaux advised against a plan to establish any liberated African settlements along the east coast of Africa. And there was a proposal to do this modeled on Sierra Leone, and also the Church Mission Society's settlement of freed slaves at Mombasa. I see Carol nodding. He warned that even if settled within the protectorate of the Zanzibari Sultanate, as guaranteed under the 1873 Slave Trade Suppression Treaty, liberated Africans would be at risk of being raided and kidnapped into slavery again. And in fact, he went on to say, returning them to any place on the East African mainland was highly inexpedient. And the same concerns were echoed elsewhere, as in Sierra Leone, early Cape Town. Sanders' work there did some of that early groundwork on liberated Africans in South Africa and in Gambia. In Sierra Leone, it was not only Portuguese, American, British, and Spanish slavers who continued, but some of the liberated Africans themselves, who actually once liberated, then became slavers as well. This is a deep problem that still has to be considered and really worked through within the continent. Prideaux cited as evidence of his to support his claim about the keeping Africans off the coast of Africa, came from a narration by Bishop Vincent Ryan. He was the Bishop of Mauritius. And Bishop Ryan was recounting the liberated African children's response to the prospect of being sent home to share, he said, with their own people the trades that they had been taught. According to Ryan, the children refused any further instruction. "Why should we learn," he quoted them as saying, "and labour, when the only reward of our industry will be that we should be sent to our people, who will either kill us or sell us again into slavery?" That redaction is at work is evident in the collective voice that suggests all children speaking as one, the collective we and our, one and many, the many in one. The bishop's report was just sufficient for Prideaux's argument. The ideal of safety had nevertheless to contend with the liberationist conundrum: what to do with the liberated people? They were subjects of the royal crown, and yet not entirely free as other subjects of the same. The answer was to satisfy both the pious Bishop Ryan and planters. Just as so much depended upon slavery, so much came to depend upon the liberated Africans. They were entered into stipulated apprenticeships, sometimes called indenture, but never, or very rarely, with the kind of training that was supposed to come with indenture and apprenticeship, certainly apprenticeship. They were placed so for periods ranging between 5 to 14 years, or they were placed in model villages of Christian converts, or they could be sent to work in the British Navy or in land armies. They could be sent to work in public works. In the Seychelles, the liberated Africans became the core of the present Seychelles nations, or the Seychellois can claim descent from over 2,500 liberated Africans landed at Port Victoria between 1862 and 1874. But often there was little difference between apprenticeship or indenture and slavery, and this was evidenced on two levels. One was the reality that being taken to a safe place did not mean that the liberated African could do as she or he wanted. The British government and local officials reserved the right to enter them into apprenticeship or indenture with select masters and mistresses. Or again, to say that you're going to serve in the army, you're going to serve in the navy. Effectively, the government and the receiving planters, masters and mistresses retained the right to dispose their labour. Indenture or apprenticeship also resembled slavery in another way. Without exaggeration, I could give you thousands of examples of what I mean, but I'm just going to give you one couple of a selection from one place, beginning with 107 of over 800 Africans liberated from 11 slave vessels in the Caribbean between 1811 and 1823. 107 were taken to indenture on Antigua. All were entered into 14 years indenture. A report compiled in 1826, published in 1827, notes beatings and floggings and other forms of punishment that you would read in the same accounts of the punishment of slaves. The beatings and punishment were for idleness and disobedience. Here's Celia, reportedly from the Congo, liberated from the Eldos Mayor. She finally had to be removed from her original indenture after 9 years with a woman named Anne Bradford, after being flogged with the whip. So much so that the court agreed that this was not right. She was being flogged for trifling reasons, to quote. Celia served out the remaining years of her indenture with another master, and she left that first indenture with an impression of a knife in her hand, to quote the record. What happened? In another instance, a slave named Caroline described how she was beaten about the neck and head with a broom by her mistress's daughter and master, who also apparently punched her, she said, in her face, after leaving to buy bread for breakfast, and was determined to have been away for so long that she deserved punishment. She tried to escape and go to the collector of customs, who was actually in charge of relegating liberated Africans to their masters and mistresses. She was intercepted by her master and forced home by 3 men. Mary, liberated from the San Jose Animas, was charged with theft and sentenced to 20 lashes with a whip in something called a cage, which was in full public view. The collector, and I quote, from a humane motive, consented to her being flogged inside the yard of the jail and not in the public cage, so that she had some privacy. A little over a decade later, in 1838, the British Secretary of State, Lord Glenelg, warned that the apprenticeship of liberated Africans in the British West Indies was close to becoming a simplistic replacement of slave labour. In the Seychelles, where the liberated Africans were called apprentices, their term was for 5 years. A former Seychelles judge, Francis Fleming, equivocated before an 1862 royal commission into the fate of the liberated Africans when he was asked whether they entered into their contracts freely and if they were given a choice. His answer conjured a tableau of mutuality in which agency and passivity were immediately recognizable roles, the master and the African. The master and the liberated African, he said, both went before the district judge and the contract was explained to both parties, and I'm quoting him, and then they entered into it. Pressed as to whether the liberated African was asked if she or he wanted to enter into this arrangement, Fleming replied flatly in the preferred pronoun of the time, he was asked. Pressed further as to whether the response was always in the affirmative, and could actually read the irritation of the commissioners at this point. Fleming stalled, and this one commissioner cuts through the politesse and says, did the liberated Africans wish to enter into a contract? Fleming said, and I'm quoting, did not know of any instance of refusal. In his experience, I'm going to give you the full quote here, he said, he never knew an African to say, I will not enter into this contract. If that question had arisen, I do not know what would have become of him, because there is no provision for a liberated African if he does not choose to work. Some days it's hard, right? The rest of his testimony refers to liberated Africans being brought and allotted. The passivity of this is, I think, evident. And in 1876, almost 70 years, 3 generations after the ban of the trade, another naval commander who had delivered liberated Africans to the Seychelles reported that sending them there was equal to banishing them entirely for a miserable pittance in conditions worse than slavery. Liberation was not freedom. Rather, it was a negative accomplishment, and not yet the accomplishment of subjective freedom, the freedom to enact one's will, no matter how narrowly that may be defined or permitted in any given society. Which is why contracts become so fetishized in such an instance as Fleming's attempt to conjure a theatre of freely entered agreement. His testimony hides the fact that liberation was not yet fully equivalent to freedom. While there was no provision for refusal, provision had been made for the disposal of liberated Africans, and that provision existed within a system that began with negotiations between nations to permit the British, and for a time the American and the Brazilian, and I forgot the British East India Company fleet, that government unto itself, right? Rogues, all, but they had a fleet that patrolled the Indian waters. But there was negotiation to permit these vessels to board ships suspected of carrying slaves. This required the establishment of a system of mutual recognition through treaty negotiation. In effect, such diplomatic and geopolitical work made the borders of European, North and South American, even Zanzibari nations mobile. Or to put it another way, borders were flexed wherever a ship sailed under a treaty nation's flag. For every success, however, one British commander claimed, there were too many slavers who escaped to even count. For example, between May and June 86 alone, Commander Charles Hotham reported the landing of some 10,000 enslaved Mozambicans in Cuba. I'm always nervous of perfectly rounded numbers, right? But that was Hotham. On both sides of the continent, captains of an intercepted vessel used treaty exemptions, where some treaties attempted to regulate the movement of slaves by requiring a free pass or passport of any African on board a ship in the Atlantic. Slavers forged these. Operating in Zanzibari waters, traders made use of Said ibn Sultan's treaties to collect slaves along the coast and sail north inside treaty waters until they could push out across the northwestern Indian Ocean to make for Muscat, Sur, or other receiving ports. They used the same routes even after 1873. Ship design also entered the contest, where dhows were able to rely under their shallow drafts to slip into estuaries that thwarted the deeper drafts of the pursuing naval vessels. Slave traders from Europe and the Americas turned to builders for faster and better ships. When captured, rather than destroying those vessels, the British simply commandeered them and to strengthen their own fleet. The international order of treaties, protocols, and political contracts required Admiralty fleets to be stationed at British colonial ports on west and east coasts of Africa, in the Mediterranean, and Sierra Leone became one of the most active of those West African bases. St. Helena was serving as the only such port in the mid-Atlantic. And then Cape Town and Mauritius enabled those fleets to actually move between the South Atlantic and the southwestern Indian Ocean. And in the north, Aden served as a port from which to patrol the northwestern Indian Ocean and Arabian Sea. Two juridical systems were attached to this network. One operated under the British flag. Those were the Admiralty fleet courts. And they were created to adjudicate the crews of seized vessels and to determine whether these people were being legally carried or illegally carried. And then there were also the mixed commission courts. This is where the sovereignty of national borders, or perhaps more correctly, the recognition of the international sovereignty of borders, was inscribed. This is where members of treaty nations sat in judgment of crews that had violated anti-slavery treaties. The mixed commission ports were established again on the West African coast in the Caribbean archipelago. Between 1819 and 1871, and in accordance with stipulations of treaties, Britain, Portugal, the Netherlands, Spain, and France appointed commissioners to these courts, where they would be able to reach mutually accepted judgments. Right? There were other countries involved who would be called Brazil, the United States, Chile, Ecuador, and Bolivia. And for 1 year, I believe it was 1861, I might be slipping, there was a mixed commission court in New York. It only lasted a year. Such arrangements might be considered ways to avoid further war in Europe, where the continent was still engaged in the long recovery from the Napoleonic Wars. Fights over each other's rights violated in the far away could not be brought back to Europe. Written ostensibly with the interests of the liberated Africans in mind, these treaties might very well be considered rehearsals for that gentlemanly gathering of the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, which rendered Africa borderless to European colonial assertions of manifest destiny, while extending and bolstering European national borders. Yet whether they knew it or not, those who would become this category of person called liberated Africans, liberation was reliant upon those agreements. And in turn, the making of the authority and jurisdiction of national borders portable without warfare needed the liberated Africans as the starting point of negotiations. What they thought or desired did not enter into discussion, as would be the case in Berlin. And yet we are confronted once again with this tension, de jure, de facto. Ships sailing under a non-treaty flag could not be boarded unless this was to cause an international incident that violated the sovereign rights of the non-treaty country. The Admiralty and mixed commission courts upheld this law rigorously, and they returned to then newly released crews who were considered illegally seized their entire cargo of captive Africans who would be sent on to where they would be enslaved. Such arrests of non-treaty ships attested to the near uniform suspicions of the naval commanders that arose, as for each effort to thwart the slave trade, slavers devised new ways of escaping even flying under those non-treaty flags. So policing the oceans for slave ships and regulating the fate of those rescued called also for new systems of surveillance. And I've written about this elsewhere, but I'm going to condense here. In effect, how to tell if the ship or dhow really was going about legitimate trade, or if it was a slaver in disguise. Admiralty vessels were provided with guidelines and checklists for discerning slave ships from a distance. They were also supposed to be able to tell a newly enslaved African from a domestic slave. And I don't even want to get into the awful language of that. So when countries had signed treaties permitting their ships to be boarded, there were loopholes. Loopholes existed that allowed trains within certain meridians, or they allowed Africans to be carried away if they had been granted passports that indicated they were not slaves. Rather, they were passengers en route to work. But how to tell if the passport was forged or not? The high-minded discourse about the shift from the regime of slavery to the regime of apprenticeship or indenture was compromised by those practiced demands for labour that traversed both. The tension between ideal and reality generated perceptual and epistemic, as well as moral anxieties among colonial authorities and abolitionists, and also slavers, though I don't think they had the moral anxieties. Although that's me, sorry. As for the subjects of their contest, the liberated Africans, we have to turn to testimonies encouraged and collected, for example, by missionaries, and also in various juridical contexts. While moral anxieties exercised abolitionists and colonial bureaucrats and liberators, peoples in Africa remained terrorized by the prospect of raids and long marches from inland to the coast. In instances where they were called to give evidence against their captors, liberated Africans' reactions to being captured, liberated, then passed into apprenticeship, constitute a relatively minute fraction in the voluminous records produced by parliamentary debates, commissions of inquiries, surveys, reports, memoranda, which is not to say they do not exist. There is a substantial body. And there's also a challenge to us to read with a squint, to find how they are present where they do not seem to be present, and how there is an affective register where they might not seem to be one. Outside, so one of the things to turn to family memories and forms of cultural expression, performances of dance, song. But much of the facticity of individuals come from these colonial records. This is the irony. However, dispositions were constrained by the parameters of inquiry, which concerned themselves with the facts of what happened, where, and when. What the newly liberated felt or thought could not be accommodated in such contexts. Neither do archival records bother with the interpretation or signification of those concepts, freedom and liberation, as they might have been perceived by those Africans. I'm very nervous about the generalization Africans. I just want to put that on record. When Commander Brooke of the HMS Vulture took down the depositions of 239 people rescued from a dhow off the coast of northwest Madagascar on the 11th of August 1874, his transcriptions suggest the unremarked presence of a translator conveying the facts of their capture. For example, an unnamed male is recorded as stating that he lived at Ogogi, not far from Kivalane. People from Anandrea, far up in the country, come and fight and catch him. Catch a great number, women, children and boys. They tied all the men and took him to Mafusi and sell him to Arab men, put a collar round his neck and keep him months in house. A great number of other slaves in house, put in dhow at daylight, and some of the slaves in-house with him, not all. The flatness of this, I mean, at another time we would talk about the trace of trauma. Here, again, not time, but just to point out here, as with Bishop Ryan's narration, the pronouns give so much away. Right? If this was a person speaking and being recorded directly, would he not say I? What might be asked has been lost in translation. What is evident is the progression from where the man lived, his knowledge of towns near and far. That the people who caught him are unnamed here might be the beginning of the process, that is the distaff of the process that abolitionists were attempting to secure. from slavery to liberation, if not yet freedom, had its prior undoing. From someone whose name is not recorded, captured by people whose identity is either unknown or lost, the trauma of being taken is perhaps marching forward. Other narratives show the same progression of undoing. Capture in the midst of violent disruption that included a village being burned, the witnessing of people fleeing, people caught or killed, and then the forced march across terrain that becomes increasingly unfamiliar, unknown, trees, the ground itself, and encounters with language completely foreign. The movement away from home is physically, psychically, the undoing of a person and the making of a captive who will learn that she or he has already been declared slave. Dispositions like those taken down by Commander Brooke and his unnamed, unremarked translator, and the redacted accounts recorded in volumes of official, now archival documents, reveal an enormous concern on the part of colonial authorities about their capacity of oversight and control. A sense of not knowing permeates documents that attempt to assert the metropole's aspirations. A lack of certainty was not only an unexpected effect of asking whether African apprentices entered their contracts freely or had an option to decline. Not knowing was exacerbated in and around all maritime contexts where slavery continued. Not knowing produced a plethora of documents whose volumes attest to what I call a bureaucratic noise of governing the potentially ungovernable treaties and legislations, as well as those slavers and colonists who were sometimes traffickers themselves when they squirreled their liberated Africans away to sell them and then declared them deceased. An argument could be made that every Admiralty seizure of a slave vessel, every mission-supported testimonial, and every prosecution of slavers testified to the persistence of the trade. And the trade testified to the demands for labor. And the demands for labor testified to the commodities to which the world had grown so accustomed, whether in Europe, the Americas, the Middle East, Gulf states, or Asia. Moreover, every contravention of an anti-slaving treaty challenged the authority of the signatories. The time of liberated Africans from slave ships might be defined as one of jockeying and instability, a time of suspicion and the changing nature of political, economic, and epistemological powers, not only for the imperial centre of Britain, but all contesting imperial and colonial powers. How necessary those treaties were, and how necessary the liberated Africans, and what a set of new challenges they became. In truth, what had been generated by anti-slavery was a new round of mass movements of people. One schooner, one brig, one dhow at a time, the numbers add into tens of thousands. This is a new mass that had to be tracked. I have written elsewhere of the device that claimed and performed certitude, the register that shared histories of accounting and categorization, quantities, volumes at disembarkation, embarkation. Three types of register appeared at the same time. The Register of Liberated Africans in 1808, the slave registers. Slave registers were really active. Do go to the Roland Street and have a look. They're extraordinary. And then there were also the Register of Indentured Indian Workers. For as the labouring African became too problematic, into the horizon of African freedom, or liberation, came the indentured Indians and Chinese workers. And also there were, for a time, brief time, in the Caribbean, some Portuguese and Italian people taken as indentured labour. As an aside here, Charles Meldrum, a doctor, praised the turn to Indian labour, attributing to them the quadrupling of the sugar harvest and revenue increase of Mauritius, and he declared this a triumph of the free over the enslaved. The purpose of the slave registers and the liberated African registers was threefold. The first two were to keep track of those enslaved before 1807, and secondly, to identify those trafficked after 1807. In itself, the pre-1807 record is devastating. even if you were born a day before that anti-slave trade, that record, that register noted that you were to be a slave at one day before. The third purpose of the registers was to perform the transcendence of the colonial officers and hence the British law's oversight across distance and time. And I've also described the logic of the register as performing a kind of bureaucratic visual grammar and social syntax that nominates, categorizes, identifies, and disposes people according to the left-right reading practice that I think all of us in this room have been schooled in. This is not unique. These accounting columns, when applied to people stalled in liberation, contain a phantom rhetoric whose force guides and determines social future. Supposedly standardized across colonies, but with their local variations, the grammar of the columns proceeds from a landed number, sex, a name. Sometimes there was an attempt to spell an African name, then the European name. Sometimes a father's name or a mother's name was there. There was always age, stature, sometimes called height, and marks or distinguishing marks. There was always a date of indenture or landing, an apprenticeship, a date of registration. Never a date of when the indenture finished. In the Seychelles Register, the final column is titled How Disposed of. In the progression, there is a sense of moving forward in time, from that time of landing, in which a new name is assigned, from which point the individual is moved toward those who have the final say, in that final right-hand margin, the masters and the mistresses. Those people in the column titled How Disposed of were so, shall we say, predisposed to their new labour. The title of that column takes on a new resonance. How Disposed of becomes a harrowing siren song of instrumentalization. Instrumentalization runs through the lives of liberated Africans in another way, in a new domain of value in which they were made to do so much more work. Or to put it another way, their liberation opened new ways for immediate profit in the trade, in and of the end of the trade. Although there had been many complaints, and there were, weekly, daily, just read the Hansards, in both Houses of Parliament in Britain, the economic gains were far-reaching. We're talking of added value. In order to understand the enormity of this new and impossible consumer market, we might consider the numbers of individuals whose movements, residencies, processing, surveillance, and sustenance had to be paid for in that so-called transition from slavery to liberation. The numbers are spread out. Only one person might have been sent to Antigua from a ship carrying a larger group, but they accumulate, as I said, into tens of thousands. Sanders and Shell estimate that around 5,000 liberated Africans, or as they were called in the Cape, prize Negroes, were landed after 1808. If you look at the correspondence by British commissioners based at the Cape of Good Hope, you'll see that they suggest some 3,500 were landed at the Cape between 1839 and 1852. As I pointed out, in the Seychelles, you had in less than 12 years, 2,500 liberated Africans landed. Wait till you get to St. Helena. The numbers are staggering. 15,000. Women, adults and children landed at St. Helena in less than a decade, beginning 1840. Although they were required to pay a wage, the masters and mistresses to whom the apprentices were assigned actually benefited from a new supply of much-needed labour at relatively low cost. Planters in different British colonies were described again and again as filled with joy. The word joy appears constantly at the prospect of receiving liberated Africans. Amid the allegations about the nature of apprenticeship, accusations also arose about profiteering from liberation. In January 1873, the Seychelles governor, Governor Gordon, was compelled to respond to newspaper reports in London of an accusation made by Henry Morton Stanley that British Navy officers who were creating whole new genres of their heroic interceptions and publishing them to great profit, that they were actually hiring out liberated Africans of the Seychelles. And Stanley claimed that for every liberated African landed at the Seychelles and sent to indenture, the English government received between 5 to 10 Maria Theresa thalers, or something like £220 sterling for each person. Governor Gordon denied the accusations, so he claimed that the liberated Africans, here we are, entered into a contract there with an employer before a stipendiary magistrate, not for the benefit of the government, but for their own, at a regular rate of wages for which no deduction is made or allowed, he says, and there'd be no way that the government could claim anything. The immediate entry into indenture, he says, was a necessary deflection of a great suffering and mortality among Africans, and a way of ensuring that their presence would not become a curse to the polite community. Nevertheless, he had to admit that it was true. There was a fixed fee paid to the government by the employer on the allotment of a liberated African. Just, he said, as an indentured fee is paid in many colonies on the engagement of coolie labourers. But the amount of this fee, he hastened to add, is fixed under regulation. Added value. While apprenticeship became the compensation for planters and other labour-hungry interests, abolitionists and British national interests could refer to the system as teaching or preparing the former captives for freedom. One consequence was an increasing inference that being a modern nation meant embracing a morality that recognized the inhumanity of slaving. It was one way that nations could insult each other also. Right? Such was the sentiment of David Livingstone, whose own mission was so compromised by his dependency as much upon the local knowledge of slavers as it was upon the knowledge of former liberated Africans from the Bombay missions and stations. They were the people who helped him find his way to Victoria Falls, and they were also the people that Speke and Burton and other explorers turned to lead them through the African landscape so they could discover places in Africa. In a March 1856 letter, Livingstone declared, "I am now proud that I belong to a country whose government possessed the high moral courage to go on its efforts to benefit the slave, in spite of all plausible sophistry brought to bear against it. This high-minded language was grounded in reformed humanism that had found its moral program, not to mention compensation, in Smithian economic relations." In November 1866, the governor of Gambia went so far as to cite Adam Smith in a report on the liberated Africans. He wrote, "They contain in themselves all the elements of a commercial people, and they evidenced parsimony." That's a characteristic declared by Adam Smith to be quintessential for a nation's achievement of real moral and economic wealth. Governor Darcy noted that liberated Africans did not shirk from hard work and that they had a capacity for trade, which he assumed would lead to the proper use of the continent's resources. Likewise, Livingstone's letter opens with the acknowledgement that the English government, or the claim that the English government is known to take a deeper interest than any other in developing the resources and promotion of civilization in Africa. Thus was abolition's sense that Africans themselves could be made into the mediums of a moralized extractivist relationship to Africa solidified. The moralizing anti-slavery movements concealed the moral failure of slavery's transformation and persistence, the unfreedom that persisted in forms of indenture and apprenticeship. They also hid the profit motive. There was money to be made, and it was made. Let us not forget that the crews and commanders of naval vessels received prize monies for each slave ship condemned and every African liberated. Complaints about the cost of anti-slaving work were made regularly, yes, in both houses of Parliament, and yet the entire project of liberated Africans continued to produce revenues and opportunities in unexpected ways. St. Helena, those liberated Africans needed blankets and clothes. Britain's mills supplied them. blankets came from what did Blake call them? The dark satanic mills. Right. Inadvertently, the efforts to keep track of liberated Africans strengthened ties between colonies and contributed to local and metropolitan economies. In 1827, the Register of Slaves on Mauritius wrote urgently of the shortage of paper for creating registers, and he asked permission to purchase paper from the Cape Colony. And the Cape Colony purchased paper from Britain. There was even economic benefit to made by photographers. The photographers, by the 1860s, were providing passport-sized photographs of liberated Africans for identification purposes. This was the practice that extended to identifying indentured Indian workers on Mauritius. At one point, the highest paid person in the entire British colonial network was a photographer based in Mauritius. He was rich, he earned more in a year than the combined salaries of the governors of Mauritius and the Cape Colony. Needless to say, they were rather outraged. And also, increasingly, there were unexpected ways in which monies were made. The British Navy depended on coal for its steamships when they arrived. And they had to take that coal where it came from, whether it was mined by slaves or not. Coal purchased from the Sulu Sultanate and Mayotte in the Comoros, for example, were most likely mined by slaves. Abolitionists perceived the apprenticeship system as a way to forestall idleness and disillusion. Commander Sullivan saw what this was really about. He said it justified the apprenticeship system, which is more than slavery, little more than slavery. The liberated Africans were delivered by the letter of the law into places where the law and its forces and its enforcers had not changed their attitude toward Africans. Much of what Sullivan wrote in his memoir had been articulated in his letters to Admiralty courts, in his letters to royal commissions, and various other investigative bodies. His commitment is clear, yet racially, while his descriptions of liberated Africans are mixed with concern and outrage, his accounts of African cultural practices are derogatory, as are the wholesale stereotyping pronouncements upon Arabic-speaking traders. Emerging from these contradictions, Sullivan and others became increasingly concerned with the plight of the individuals who had been abducted or dislocated, in tandem with the question of the national, or rather continental wealth that was being compromised by slavery's destruction of local African populations. Here is his question: what country in the world could stand such a constant drain? He addressed the question in precisely the idioms of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which had given to laissez-faire economics its moral program. Slipping between a generalized Africa and a reference to an unspecified country, Sullivan reasoned that the drain of its population disabled the country. It disrupted trade, and it rendered Africa, that great continent, agriculturally barren. Moreover, the effect would not be contained within Africa. It would, he warned, be felt throughout the world, perhaps for centuries. How much better, he argued, it would be to benefit all other nations of the world if Africans were left where they were, to make available the immense wealth of Africa, which now lies buried and dormant to the world. This was a profound change in the conception of Africa on the part of European imperialists. No longer was it just a source, it had become a resource. Not just a place from which to extract, but a site of extractivism. For all their altruism, the remarks by people like Governor Darcy and Sullivan about the potential of African labour in realising Africa's wealth remain within an extractionist logic. It is the one that underpinned slavery. It was the attendant logic that perceived Africa as borderless between European, American, Omani, and other desires for labour and resources. We have come full circle. Africans have been left behind, and the surplus value continues to be extracted. Looking at the desperate migrants rejected at Europe's Mediterranean borders, or turned from the USA, we see how now the advice to let Africans remain in Africa has become a refrain Go home, Africans. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yvette. So, well, those of you who need to leave for 2 o'clock appointments, of course, we understand that you don't wish to depart. I think we'll take another 10, 12 minutes or so for perhaps 2 or 3 comments or questions from the floor. So it's open.
It's the campus nature. I'm surprised people weren't leaving before. It's always the thing. It's with my students. I'm always saying, I had a professor who gave 3-hour classes, and if we left, we would be docked. But leaving one must. Leave one must. Yes.
So
Sally.
there's so much, and I'm just picking up a smallest piece here. So the idea, so you're working with this archive of liberated African registers, or the registers of liberated Africans. So these are actual historical documents, resources. But then I really like what you did almost immediately afterwards. You also then spoke about the kinds of special syntaxes associated with that, and the kind of reading practices. So these documentary records or registers also have about them registers of expression, of representation, of framing that intrigue you. Can you speak a little bit about that in relation to your creative work?
Oh, okay, yes, because sometimes it's, reading document after document, not just the registers, but all kinds of things. I mean, I really do read the coal records, I read ledgers, I just everything, ship captain's logs, astronomers, gatherings for the Royal Geographical Society. And what I have to deal with as a scholar is my rage, my despair, and at some days you're riven reading this. Young woman landed at the Seychelles. She has a month-old baby. If she has been walking from inland, when was that baby conceived? Sometimes the journey took 4 months. When was that baby conceived? When was that baby? How? That is missing. She is landed and she is sent to work for a man on Poivre Atoll. Do Google Poivre Atoll. I believe it's maybe a couple of feet or inches bigger than this room. Not a tree on it. What would that have meant to her? That's when the what and the what if begins to come, and then you smell the surf, you feel the wind blowing, because if the wind blew over that atoll, and really hard, you know what it's like to be on the beach when that cuts, then that's where the scholarship has to make way for something for which otherwise it doesn't want to have to deal with. Although your work is absolutely genre blurring, and you're asking of people to think more in a more plastic way about these different disciplines and styles and modes. I don't know that I've answered that question. I really don't. It's almost impossible. In Imprenda Hora, when I do the Indian Ocean section, I'm actually using one of the slave registers and just using the flatness of the number so-and-so, and then putting these other little glosses and comments. And I always say they're not in the voice of, they're more epitaphs. Here lies, and lies in every way, because these documents that I'm looking at are not always truth-bearing. They have made truths.
So, Yvette, one of the most horrifying parts of your narrative for me was how the abolitionists that you quoted went along with the system of indenturement as a kind of paternalistic aid to these poor unfortunate people. surely there were some abolitionists on the good side who were
Absolutely.
denouncing
Yes.
and trying to expose the system. Could you say something about these people?
Yes, I do believe that Sullivan is a man of his time. These are not bad people. They are people who are undoing what they learned. They are people who believe their gospels. They are people who believe, even if they're atheists, they are people who believe in what is wrong. They are people who can't categorical imperatives. At all times, in all places, all people should be free. So I don't think that they're evil and bad people. They're compromised, as was David Livingstone, that he could only get to where he wanted at times by attaching to a slave caravan. But there were people. I think that Sullivan was court-martialed because he insisted on arresting non-treaty ships. So yes, there were. Where you really find this are in the mission documents. The missionaries, particularly the women, who are trying so hard. They're in the distaff. They're under their husbands, who are the main people. The women missionaries are meeting. They're learning from women that they're working with, and do you remember there's the Women Writing Africa volumes, the volume 1, the Damon et al. Thank God for those. A tour de force of archival achievement. Penelope, one of the French missionaries' daughters. I'm floundering. I'll give that reference to you, just to read her description of her refusal to call Africans by any of those slandering words. And yes, of course, they exist, but they are compromised also, because that woman is still part of a colonial enterprise, whether she likes it or not. That's why that's a period of, it's such an unstable time, and it's a time rife with contradiction. And the I can sling off at people here, but I'm very careful about just assigning blanket blame, because these were people in transition. When I read the burden of what it meant for someone to be flogged, what it meant for a woman to have been stabbed, and the record to just say she had the impression of a knife in her hand, then I'm actually, my real big gripe is with the masters and the mistresses and those people who refused to change. And this is a pedagogical enterprise also. They had to be taught how to find and rely upon waged labour. So I don't know that this is a very difficult question to answer. I go back and forth and back and forth. But I'm not just overly mean towards these people. And there are people who went and lived and died there, but they still had their weird biases. So, OBS. Oh, sorry, yes.
Thank you. The question is a bit for the most powerful exposing. It seems, as I hear you, that there are potentially powerful implications for this work of analysis. This is what I'd like to press you to see if you would like to say anything more about the ways that these kinds of racialized logics, the kind of grammar that you described, find their way, echoes in public discourse. I mean, right at the end, you spoke about a little, but it seems that, to the extent that you think of the historical record as creating a neat, reassuring brick in 1807.
Exactly.
Using what this work does.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether you would want to say about the sort of racialization of citizenship and the kind of global inequalities that persist.
Trayvon Martin, Neighbourhood Watch, the guidelines for Neighbourhood Watch. Do go and read the vagrancy laws that come about as the colonies are preparing for the inevitable, that slavery will be abolished. Vagrancy laws were just picked up. The 1609 Poor Law in Britain, which criminalised poverty, during the plague years, when the poor were trying to flee infected towns, as the wealthy were. They were forced back. You just see these conglomerate subjects, rogues, villains, vagabonds. Where you see one, you will see all. The one is the sign of all. How do you tell? You discern by their clothes. If there is no officer of the law, then it is up to the citizen to do a citizen's arrest. And if you don't, you could be prosecuted. Lift that up, take it to Virginia Colony, take it to Antigua, take it to St. Kitts, take it to Zanzibar. It becomes racialized. And the high moralizing language of why to work for your master is pious and good is inserted there. And Marx would have a lot to tell us about the moralizing capitalist, right? That is one way. And I teach a course called Before Black Lives Matter, where we look at that march all the way to the neighborhood watch rules that have now been changed for that neighborhood watch group that Zimmerman belonged to. Not only that, bring it to South Africa, and then read the Group Areas Act. It begins with categories of people, which is what those vagrancy acts created. The categories of people and property. It was about property, trespass, who could be on certain property and who couldn't. In the colonies around the end of slavery, it's absolutely racialized. So it's just one way, what we would call forces and compulsions. Read.
Do you know that in the last 2 months there was the city of Cape Town attempted to clean the streets?
Yes. It is. Actually, it is. What I have done is we have read neighbourhood watch guidelines in South Africa as well. Where you see some of this playing out is the municipal laws. Always read municipal laws. Always. And say in Johannesburg, the municipal laws about street vendors are actually the old apartheid era laws. You should have a look at them. They're horrendous language. Forces and compulsions.
Wow.
Yes.
So let's have if we can have two brief final comments from Obi and Sonwa Village. Yes. Sorry.
Obi. Yes.
Two very interesting books.
Yes.
Called Weir's The African History in the New World and Eric Williams' Slavery.
Yes.
Yes. And I think that the soldiers explore these questions in so many ways. And I want you to, if you could, relate some of the data you just discovered, the works of Africans, especially in slavery and capitalism.
Look, I think what my project is trying to do is to look at the relations not just in one area, but the whole, what is an international. It's not global, but it is an international exchanges of documents, exchanges of laws and attitudes, and that continue to compel, that continue to have force today. So that's one thing. I'm not sure the question about the figures. I didn't quite follow the numbers.
Well, I'm talking about the data in terms of this. Data that we just sort of compares us to ask a question about capitalism, neoliberalism, and the connections to contemporary reality. How would you connect that to Eric Williams' own ideas, especially in that same book?
I think that there must be an affinity, but I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know how I would do that, except to say that I think that we would be in agreement that there's clearly an affinity. I think that the data, if by data I'm understanding that all of the bodies of work that I'm reading in many different contexts, one of the big challenges has been to find the abolitionist jurisprudence It's not a challenge because it's there, but it's my linguistic limitation that makes it a challenge. Arabic-speaking context of jurisprudence and continental abolitionists, which absolutely exist. I'm reading, with the help of translators, the Brazilian abolitionist movements. I'm reading within Portugal the abolitionist movements. Even officials who went to Ilha de Mozambique, who were actually arrested for being abolitionists there. So I'm reading, I think that where I might still be in an affinity, but just trying to be more expansive in the sense that if I read in a particular archive, that archive tells me not to look anywhere else. So that's all.
Because what I think.
I don't know if I've answered.
In some ways, you have to go mostly French, English.
Yeah.
There's enough silence.
Silence is a wonderful thing to look for and work for. That's what I was suggesting earlier. The silences. It's you know that old game, you know that when you were children you got the drawing the dots and then you saw the giraffe. And the silences for me, the challenge, that's the archivist's it's the dream. Sorry, somebody.
Thanks. I think your talk has really triggered a lot of interest. I mean, it's quite detailed. I can't say I've grasped everything you said.
It's a lot.
Yeah, but just two. First one is a comment.
Yeah.
I may have missed it. I know that we do touch on the court cases. I don't know who brought these court cases, whether it was Livingstone or other. I'm interested in the agency of the Liberated Africans to Admiralty. I don't know whether we have explored that.
I do. So what today, basically what today is providing the big framework for what is my project. You know, agency is a word I always want to define, because agency to me is the ability to read and negotiate with all the rules and the parameters and the deadlines and the trenches that exist anywhere. So I do read them in Seychelles, for example, how liberated Africans are just disappearing themselves into their communities. And at one point, the then Governor Salman is saying, these people just go and it's terrible. Don't they know we're doing good for them? And they're just changing their names. And we can't find them. We don't know where they are in the record. So there is escape. And why I kept insisting that we need to know that the Seychelles, the nation today, right, these are the descendants of the liberated Africans. There is a time after, and I do pursue that. I pursue and read very, very carefully what I feel and read nervously are the redacted statements. Why I read just that one today is there are so many of those, and they're flat, and they come again and again and again, but they do reveal something. They reveal someone who knows where he's from. He knows the near and the far. This is deixis. But deixis is undermined when you're being walked through places where you can't say where here is, where there is, where now is, where then is. And that's what I do read for.
There was a second one, but okay.
Could you just do the one and then move from
okay.
Yes.
So as someone whose name is home,
yes.
I was curious about the last line.
Yes.
Go home, Africans.
Yes.
And often I've been told go home, it implies that I'm trespassing, right? And so I'm curious about where your work is going after that that quote, and just thinking about where is home,
Exactly.
especially when we live in societies that are built with these. Think of the book Reproducing Racism, where socioeconomically there are these feedback loops that create the same results, right? And these ways of criminalizing that render us homeless and in poverty, like create those cycles. And when I think about when race was created, the word Negroid was created, Caucasoid, Australoid, all of that. It wasn't connected. There's no Negro land, right? So it's, the beginning.
It had to be made. Right?
Yeah. So where is that?
So I don't know that the contemporary isn't finding where I go. My project, I think that the book ends by asking about contemporary slavery, because it doesn't end. There is no neat line. In fact, we call it human trafficking today, and it is probably the largest shadow. It is the largest shadow economy, and there are so many protocols at the United Nations watch almost every year, and nothing happens. One of the differences is that the traffickers today will get on a ship and come and shoot you where you are, whereas you could shame them before. I think the disgrace, with respect to Mr. Patsiel, is the disgrace right now is you cannot shame the traffickers. But I don't know what I do. This translates into my teaching, so that my students can take off and go further. But home, that is another question. That is a huge question. I would read Toni Morrison's essay Home. It's one of my favorite. I call it the essay of Toni Morrison. Yeah, do read it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Yvette.